Where were you on January 6, 2021? What did you feel as you watched that Trump-fueled riot, an actual insurrection, a disgusting and humiliating security breach, made far worse by the U.S. government's failure to handle it all? We turn right now to our special report on a key aspect of this disaster with these calls for accountability. This report is on the contrast and double standard in policing that was on display in America yesterday. First, the context. This failure occurred at the seat and literal center of U.S. democracy, the Capitol building, both houses in session, the sitting vice president on hand. This is, of course, one of the highest level national security events that can be held in Washington, on par with the State of the Union. Gatherings that are also known as priority terrorist targets. A bomb or attack could take out many elected leaders, as well as the top people in the line of succession to be president. This gathering, of course, planned long in the making, promoted online, embraced by the sitting president, and yet federal law enforcement, overseen by the Trump administration, was off guard or absent. Cameras caught no fortified police presence at the Capitol as things got underway yesterday. Virtually no militarized policing units, no preventive show of force, no long guns out. Police had set out some low barriers and cops were in street uniforms, not riot gear. Trump administration said 350 members of the D.C. National Guard were plenty sufficient, quote, mainly to assist with traffic control. Now today, we see the blame game already. Leaks that the Capitol Police themselves were the ones rejecting officers of any federal help. Now this first failure, which is part of many failures and double standards, is the incompetent or willful failure to protect and prevent, on display in the first breach of the perimeter by that mob. A handful of officers were running away up the stairs with no backup, apparently, no militarized presence behind them to literally get their backs. So at this federal national security venue, federal power was suspiciously MIA. And that totally pales in comparison to other events like the State of the Union or inaugurations, which are comparable, but it also pales compared to gatherings where virtually no public officials are in danger, with almost no national security implications. And yet we've seen militarized police and federal agents and even military at Black Lives Matter protests through the years. Take Ferguson, where full tanks were already on the street, or at police brutality protests back in Baltimore, we saw those heavily armed forces with riot gear. There was no delay, no wait for militarized reinforcement then. You weren't going to breach that barrier. The same Trump administration that basically sat out yesterday in its hometown of Washington also found a way to deploy heavily armed security forces all the way out to Portland, where police protests apparently drew their ire, as well as protests of Donald Trump's policies. Or go back to just Washington last summer, where at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the feds showed the range of force they could muster, even absent the evidence of crimes that we saw on display on television yesterday. So as Americans take this all in, as Americans live through yesterday, this lenient treatment of a criminal mob at the Capitol, that's one piece of it. But then there's the negative space in the scene, which is in, I think, anyone's mind who has objectively lived through even just the past year in America. This contrast in policing. Now, some were asking, where was the real police and protection? While leaders are now scrutinizing a failure that goes to the top of the federal government.
It goes beyond the Capitol Police. It goes to the FBI. What was the shortcoming in their intelligence that they provided? It goes to the Department of Defense. How long did it take for them to respond or anticipate the need for the National Guard? It goes to many other elements of the executive branch, and I think we have to have a full review.
Some of this delay is already documented. Trump held back the National Guard. Pence then okayed them late. So we already have some evidence that the Trump administration's decisions ensured law enforcement at the scene was totally underprepared, and that made things worse. The officers and equipment that was missing yesterday left a tougher situation for any law enforcement who did show up, which further compromises their response. And it was chaos. Rioters taking over the United States Capitol, just smashing their way in, committing property damage, breaking the glass windows. They made their way all the way up to the Senate dais, where one Trump supporter reportedly yelled, "Trump won," a final lie, an ignominious scene. They were climbing, hanging off walls of the United States Capitol. So consider the contrast in how police responded to these riots versus so many other situations. In some places, officers so overrun they appeared, in a way it looked like, to give in or facilitate the rioters' entry. Here's a moment from a video that went viral. People trespassing on government property, breaking the law, and police seemed to kind of back away and let them in. You may have seen this video. It was a bad scene, but you have to put these videos in context. They don't tell the entire story. You should know tonight, an independent eyewitness at that very spot and a reporter who shot the video, Mark DiPola, says they didn't see police trying to help the rioters, but rather backing off and simply de-escalating, with rioters advancing, threatening to punch officers who at that point appeared to be highly outnumbered. Now, online people viewed the clip as officers actively trying to open the barricades. Now, DiPola says, the person on the scene, it was more about police abandoning their post rather than trying to help. You can view it there with this information and assess it for yourself. It's a problem either way. If those police did abandon a position rather than lean into a physical clash, that's a tactical choice. But even that, I want you to know tonight, contrasts with recent scenes like this in a far less vital national security zone. This was not the U.S. Capitol, but rather a scene on the streets of L.A. where officers were engaging extremely physically to escalate and hit and strike Black Lives Matter protesters, hitting them with batons, shooting projectiles when they were reportedly standing there with their hands up. That's how some officers were dealing with, as you saw there, peaceful protesters in the light of day who were nowhere near the vice president or the entire Congress. It looked like state-sanctioned violence, a contrast to this treatment of Trump supporters who weren't peaceful, who breached federal property, who threatened officers, and worse. This is where the double standard goes beyond some of that big picture structure I mentioned, whether at a policy level the Capitol was properly staffed and protected. And we get into some of these personal interactions. Here's an officer assisting someone during these criminal riots, pouring water in their eyes to reduce the impact of the tear gas that the same officers themselves dispersed. This is what it looks like when, even amidst an ongoing emergency that included a death, an officer goes out of their way to assist people on the scene in the trespassed area. A total contrast to police actions at many BLM protests, where peaceful protesters were tear gassed, then they were fleeing, they weren't on any trespass property, they weren't rendered any aid to reduce the impact on their eyes or their health. These are facts. Now, this report tonight is not trying to proclaim what the ideal tactic is in every policing situation. This report is showing the facts of an American reality. But let's be clear. These are facts that many would rather ignore or minimize or lie about. This is America. This is the double standard that many would rather not face. On the left, the police rendering aid to people in a crowd while they were still actively breaking the law and trespassing, breaching the Capitol at a crime scene that included a killing. On the right, police treating black and brown people and other BLM supporters who, by most accounts in the public square, were not breaking any law, certainly not trespassing. I gotta tell you, as part of my job, this is where words themselves also can fail us. Because this double standard, it can make even simple terms pretty Orwellian. As journalists, we refer to the police and federal agents as law enforcement. It's supposed to just be like a factual term, nothing more than that. But take a look at a member of the Capitol Police in riot gear who appears to be escorting a lawbreaker, a person who broke federal law, you see there, down the steps, and then releasing the vast majority of these people, not arresting them. The people inside the Capitol were breaking the law. They were in an active trespass zone. They also broke other strict laws that protect federal buildings. If a person is helping walk them out in the middle of that law breaking, can we accurately call that law enforcement? Because they're not enforcing the law in that moment. It's broader, of course, than any picture that goes viral, any single moment. These recent BLM protests in Washington, for example, were largely peaceful. There was not a single breach of the Capitol, for example, but DC police arrested 289 people in one day at those recent BLM protests and 427 over 4 days. You see there. They made just 41 arrests yesterday amidst a criminal and national security breach that the U.S. has not seen at this Capitol since 1812. If you take the larger count of arrests beyond the Capitol, by the way, it jumps to 68, but 41 of them in that criminal mob at the Capitol. Those are some numbers. They may not go as viral as some of these pictures and videos, but they're that larger factual context. And after the many hours that this played out yesterday, after Mitch McConnell was so moved to call it an insurrection on the floor of the Senate, after the world rebuked the United States, then the feds under the Trump administration found their way to filing their first charges today. And we heard more Orwellian words from the FBI, which of course Donald Trump has systematically pressured and hollowed out its leadership. I can report for you the FBI now claims they're doing basically a manhunt. They're seeking information, they say, to identify and to find these people. I'm sorry. How are you going to do a manhunt for people who spent hours doing their crimes on live TV and then, as I just showed you, got escorted out by those officers? Why is this FBI under this administration claiming to seek information when you have people who told the New York Times their names while taking time out of their crime scene to pose for a photo, holding up the Speaker of the House's stolen mail, or this Trump supporter walking out of the Capitol with the Speaker of the House's lectern? Spare us the jargon about seeking information to find these people. When you let these criminals walk in and out of the seat of government, this contrast. This is America. This white man there, leisurely sitting at the desk of the elected Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States. The police response so lax he had the time to gloat and pose, compared to how police instantly arrested the woman you see on the right. She committed no visible crime. She was protesting the police shooting of Alton Sterling in 2016. She said she was exercising her free speech rights. Police took her away on a charge of obstructing a highway. All of these interactions demand scrutiny. And let me be clear, because I always try to be as contextual and fair as possible. It's not because any personal interaction is a problem for police to show some compassion or warmth to people they serve, like an officer embracing a child, something many can relate to. There were officers who knelt during those BLM protests this summer. They said they wanted to offer a form of respect amidst those controversies. The double standard on display this week is something far deeper. It is a selective embrace, very specifically, of some Americans, even as they're literally part of a mob attacking officers and breaking laws. Some officers going forward here to take a selfie in the middle of an active crime scene, in the middle of the trespassing with these individuals. A contrast to the all too routine personal escalation by other officers against, for example, BLM protesters exercising a First Amendment right, here being shoved to the ground. Escalation. Now, we can't read anybody's minds, including these officers, but we can report what they do. The seemingly warm energy yesterday absent at a very recent protest at Republican leader McConnell's office. Capitol Police finding, in that instance, they knew how to make instant arrests, even on camera. They knew how to drag away protesters, some of them, by the way, in wheelchairs. What a contrast to how different people are treated by the same Washington police force, not based apparently on whether the crimes were in progress, not based on an objective threat, but rather the documented double standard based on whether those individuals were deemed by law enforcement as somehow sympathetic to police or their politics, or somehow deemed an enemy of the state. Enemies because they are black or brown or doing activism that may back brown and black people, or other protests that are deemed as simply criticizing parts of policing or perhaps some part of the incumbent government. Not reading minds, just reporting the disparate treatment. Now, these facts are not new, nor are the double standards. Some of the documentation is new. We have more cameras today, we have more mobile phones, we have more networks that anyone can use online to share the videos that document these very old, enduring facts of America. And some of those videos may have helped change some minds in 2020. Some of this documentation may have mobilized people in November. And again this week in Georgia. The facts, when documented, do matter. Never forget that. I mean that. I want you to know that tonight, even amidst this horror show. And yet we also need to be clear about these old truths. From my reporting, it seems like Black Americans know these truths. It's especially dangerous for them not to. It seems like most white Americans know these truths. It seems like these rioters knew these truths, these facts very well. It seems like they took this double standard as a given, something our colleague Joy Reid made very clear amidst the mayhem and the breaking news in her significant remarks last night.
They know that they are not in jeopardy because the cops are taking selfies with them, walking them down the steps to make sure they're not hurt. White Americans are never afraid of the cops, even when they're committing insurrection, even when they're engaged in attempting to occupy our capital. In their minds, they own this country. Guarantee you, if that was a Black Lives Matter protest in D.C., there would already be people shackled, arrested, or dead.
Arrested? We'll take that in. We just showed you that's not a hypothetical guarantee for the future. That's the recent history. I can also report to you there was standard police work yesterday. There was a scattering of cops that did attempt to hold barricades as rioters overtook them. That may not have gone viral, but that was part of the policing. There was the attempt to block the door into the Capitol, with Trump supporters closing in on both sides. There's this now infamous photo of Capitol Police literally barricading the entrance to the House chamber, guns drawn, defending the U.S. government from the followers of the U.S. president. Harrowing images of a violent attack that was, we know, weeks in the making, encouraged partly by Donald Trump's assaults on democracy. It's unacceptable. What happened is, even amidst everything we know and this enduring history, a low point for American democracy. There are some who've wrongly said, well, this just isn't who we are. But this is who we are. This is who we were yesterday. And let me tell you something. It's who we are today and tomorrow, unless and until we do something about it. If you are sitting through all of this and you're thinking nothing ever changes or it only gets worse, I would tell you from reporting on this and observing it, I understand exactly how you feel. But a lot of things are changing. At the local level, we've reported on the changes to district attorneys, to policing policies, to record-breaking support for Black Lives Matter over this past difficult year. Indeed, the spasm of violence with its racial overtones yesterday is in part a response to the fact that things can change. Those physical mob assaults on the seat of our democracy were a response to the fact that more people in Georgia and around the nation have voted to change both political branches, the Congress and the White House, in different hands. A lot is changing, even as it feels like too many things are not. But as for what happened yesterday and the lack of arrests and the lack of accountability, we do return to the question, a question for all of us, from our government down to our citizens. You've seen the facts. They're not new. What are we going to do about it?